Thank you so much, Doreen, and thank you, Samia and Anjuli, for inviting me here to talk tonight. And thank you for all the students that were there the whole day, because it's really, as you will see, a lot of practices and research that you are doing is in a way of deep concern to me as well. So I'm very happy that we have shared this day together, and already in January. So thanks a lot. Before starting, I always take just a moment to situate myself, so that we all somehow know from where I'm speaking from, and it's not situating in the sense of biography, but more in the sense of what constituted me through that biography. I was born in Yugoslavia, which later became Slovenia. So to a kind of more like a dissident family, not a real communist family. So I was taught how to hear something at home and not tell it outside the home in that way. So in a way, I was in a little bit way brought up to be pretending to adhere to the communist socialist system of Yugoslavia. And I think it's something that stuck to me a lot in the sense of questioning what this space of shared brotherhood and unity that Yugoslavia was, what kind of lies and hidden stories it was generating. Although it was at the same time a space which had a strong anti-colonial legacy through the movement of non-aligned countries that Tito, our president, was part of, and this Doreen has been working on for quite a long time. So it's something that, even though the dissidence was there, I always remember these moments where the first precious objects that I've seen in my family were, for example, beautiful plates coming from Lebanon, from Syria, from Ethiopia, because they were given to my father as gifts by his students that were coming from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Ethiopia, Sudan, etc. So in a way, this space this relational space, actually, that was Yugoslavia in that way at the time when I was brought up, really stuck to me a lot, and which was then, of course, very much shattered by the war. In Croatia and Bosnia. I mean, in Slovenia, we are always proud to say we had 10 days of war, which is true. But I mean, I lived through it. I still have it in my flesh and blood. But also, I lived through the refugee crisis that came through the refugees, especially from Bosnia and Croatia, and among them there were members of my father's family who was born in Bosnia. So it's something that marked me deeply, and that continues to mark me when I see the space of Europe and its responses and non-responses today in the light of the different waves of people who are seeking refuge in Europe from different countries in the world that are in conflicts induced by the late capitalism, and especially by the continuation of the Western coloniality that drives those people out from their countries. And I was also marked very much by, so in a sense, this kind of anti-colonial struggle that became much later, let's say, in a way like a point of research, let's say. But also, I was very much marked by Chernobyl. I mean, I was 10 years old when Chernobyl happened, and the same day we were walking in nature, the day after, while the clouds were dispersed around and so on, we were eating salad and mushrooms, although we were told that we were not supposed to, and we were doubting, but why not salad? Why not this? Why not? So, in a way, this invisibility of a threat that is induced by a human, and that is in a way this presence of nature that we think that we domesticated and we did not at all, is something that is for me in this light of Chernobyl, let's say in this presence of what Chernobyl had for me, and I think it's by then that very early on I became really interested in climate change and environmental politics, which were at the time in the early 80s just coming as a kind of consciousness into the space of Yugoslavia. So now I began with this. I'm going to jump a little bit around today, so bear with me. It's a very unstructured talk. It's just there to really share with you what talks to me, what I wish to do with me being a curator, and how I understand that practice. So I think that just to continue on this, I think that curatorial practice for me is something that that keeps on challenging me because I can't define it and I don't want to, and it's a space that enables me to exchange, think, appreciate, admire, be inspired by, and possibly even affect people to whom I talk to whenever I'm doing projects and exhibitions. And so I'm starting from now and going maybe then a little bit back if the time will allow me. As Doreen mentioned, I was selected for chosen sounds like teleology. I was selected for the Contour Biennial, which just recently had a remarkable feature. It was curated by Nataša Petrešin-Bachelez. I don't know if any one of you have seen it, but it was about she worked on the notion of justice as a medium, and social justice in particular, bringing together a wonderful group of artists. And when I tried to think how, through everything what I did until now, what would be really of my interest, and I will go deeper into it, when I started to research about Mechelen, which is this small town next to Brussels. I mean, small, now it's small, but it used to be a capital in Belgium. It still has like many different big churches and so on, but one thing struck me, and it immediately, you know how it is, like when you're starting to do research, something calls you in. So there is a light that opens, there is a channel, there is a tunnel that opens up, and you feel like something is directly speaking to you, and this was this locomotive. I'm sorry because I made a mistake. It's Le Belge. It was called Le Belge. It was the first continental railway that was built in Europe in 1835, and it was going between Mechelen and Brussels. And from there on, it started to develop to Antwerp, and from then on to also other places around Belgium, and continued up north, and then also into other countries. But reading a little bit more into that, this was one of the reasons why during the Nazi occupation, the Nazi decided to use that railway system, which was really well built and functioning since a long time and was really expanded well, in order to build one of the 2 transit camps outside of Germany, and it was in Mechelen. And from there, over 25,000 Jews and Roma were sent directly to Auschwitz, actually. So thanks to that train as well. So I thought, okay, this is immediately my starting point. It is the wish to talk at the same time about the symbol that train represents when we're talking about the Anthropocene, and we talked today on several occasions about it with the students, which in a way for me, as you will see, it's a kind of oscillation between, of course I'm thinking about like the terms that have been used around this term of Anthropocene, but also about the dates. I mean, because in relation to the train and in relation to the steam engine that led to the building up of a possibility of a transport system, this belongs to one of the definitions of the date of beginning of the Anthropocene, which is defined by Paul Crutzen as 1784, the definition of the steam engine, I mean the invention of the steam engine. Whereas, on the other hand, another date has been proposed by Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, that you probably also have heard about, in 1610, when, according to them, the Anthropocene should correspond with shifts in carbon deposits because of the death of more than 50 million indigenous residents of the Americas in the first century after European contact, which were the result of genocide, famine, enslavement, and, of course, contact with the Europeans and with the viruses. So for me, in a way, in that photo, and for example, we can see it here in the painting. This is also like a painting that shows Mechelen from 1835, this idea of progress and growth, which is in a way inseparable from the transport system, from this locomotive, is in a way for me the heart, what I wanted to propose to the Biennial. And furthermore, what I'm really thinking about is about the ways of decolonize the Biennial. What would it mean to actually work, to take this term that has been used many times, it has been almost becoming it's an incontournable. It's a word that becomes in academia incontournable, but with the danger that it begins to be said by people who are not at all concerned by what it really means. And also it means it represents different things to different positions. So in my position, decolonizing a biennial would really be working to go against, not against, but to think about a space which, according to, for example, also the decolonization as a process, according to Achille Mbembe, would represent this moment where you actually open the space to think in an alternative way. He talks, of course, about the African continent, not about the Europe, but I think within Europe we have a possibility, since it belongs to the global north, to actually start talking about the degrowth. And the degrowth is this kind of set of practices that have been circulating around different notions of everyday practices, of sustainability, of ecology, of resilience. But I would also add, very importantly, and I will quote him later, as a point where it's very important to link those processes into the social movements and to the social relations, and how actually when we're talking about racism, that it is very closely related to something called environmental racism, where in the urban fabrics there are always poor neighborhoods, migrant neighborhoods that will first be exploited, that will first be polluted, and not, of course, the gentrified sections of the cities. But I'll come a little bit back to that in a second. And it's obviously also related to what we were talking today again, about the scarcity of the resources, especially, for example, about the possibility that the oil will no longer be there in a few years, that, for example, the air travel itself will become a luxury. And so how do we, in the art world, which is a terribly unsustainable environment, where we are asked to jump on airplanes in order to go for one day to a lecture, for one day to visit a biennial, for one day only across the world on the other side of the planet, how do we render this specific area of what we do in contemporary art practices? How can we render this sustainable and in that sense responsible? For example, I was very much inspired by a proposition by a French sociologist, Razmik Keocheyan, who wrote a book, Nature is a Battlefield, where he introduces the notion of ecological debt. which a lot of social movements and social justice movements for the global south have recently put forward. And he says by exploiting, I'm quoting him, by exploiting their natural resources and hence by durably damaging their environment, industrialized countries owe a huge debt to countries of the South. This ecological debt is much bigger than the financial debt the South supposedly owes the North. Taking it into account would completely transform the way we think about the global economy. And I think it's something, and it's again not trying to work on, well, yes, it's trying to work also on the notions like guilt and shame, as I will go a little bit forward in the talk into that. But again, this kind of necessity actually to take a position from where we are speaking. I mean, I'm working within Europe, so I feel responsible to contribute in some way with a kind of a model, a possible model for thinking these things. So what is also interesting is that outside of Mechelen there is the largest auction place for vegetables and fruits, and it's called the Garden of Europe. I mean, how more beautiful can it be? And they just recently, in last year, they installed more than tens of thousands of solar panels and reduced their carbon emissions for around, I think at least 100 metric tons, which is quite a lot. Knowing that, for example, the metric tons of CO2 are around 0.22 for 1,000 kilometers done by a car. And so I proposed to, I have a desire to work with that space as well as to continue from this thinking about the air travel. I will also try to work around the idea of having at least 3/4 of people coming in, not by air, but by either trains, boats. Not saying that this is maybe, boats are also very polluting, but just to see if by reducing the parameter of interest, I could also do something about the carbon emissions, about the whole process and production of the project. This is one thing, and especially to stay a little bit more with the trouble of this kind of colonial capitalism. That is, I think, one of the most important notions that we should tackle with when we talk about ecology today. It's this kind of repetition of a colonialist drive to extract either from the labor of the slaves or extract from the nature. I mean, there is this obvious today and very much debated analogy between the two. And Ghassan Hage, who is an anthropologist, a Lebanese anthropologist based in Australia, in Melbourne, he has been recently thinking about I think a very urgent connection, which reflects in the title of his coming book, which is Islamophobia an environmental threat? He links the notion of ungovernability that we encounter in dealing with the waste, with toxic waste, with everything that is produced as a side effect of capitalist production and accumulation. He puts this in perspective as when he talks about the ungovernable refugees, when he refers, of course, to the refugees recently coming to Europe and representing this kind of threat to the Europeanness, to that kind of values that are represented by some kind of probably obviously driven by Enlightenment values. And this I can tell you, it's very clear also when we are in France, just as an example, the whole question of the race is being debated only now in France on the pretext of well, we didn't have to talk about race since we have our maxim, which is liberté, égalité, fraternité. And so this threat, and he describes it, Hage describes it as a notion of being besieged by the feeling of being besieged of these European subjects, which are white, Catholic subjects mostly, but not only, but mostly, that this kind of threat that is ungovernable refugees is similar to how we react to ungovernable waste. And so he brings this together in a very interesting way, as well as relates to obviously in the whole system of colonial capitalism. He sees it as a kind of unifying principle between racialization, domination, and exploitation of people, as well as the alienation, domination, and exploitation of resources, which I mentioned before. In that way, Mechelen again is a place of interesting social, I will not call it experiment, but social situation where apparently due to a study, they found out that apparently none of the youngsters from Mechelen has gone to fight in Syria or Afghanistan or to other fronts of civil war. Whereas just in neighboring cities and towns, there has been more than like 40%, let's say, of young people, but not in Mechelen. And Mechelen has been also, I mean, it's a very it will be a very interesting and I think a very difficult thing to tackle with, because they have what they call an officer for de-radicalization, but he's called an officer. So, and he's a white Belgian man whose task is to de-radicalize youth in the ways that he thinks the government or the government thinks that they should be doing. So, in a way, this is something that I wish also to work upon, especially because there have been there are I think 2 different centers that are organized in Mechelen for the accueil, for the introduction of refugees to the town. There are guiding tours where refugees guide one another through. There are lectures by people that are asylum seekers and that have some that are professionally teachers and so on. So there is a lot of endeavors and a lot of action done around that, which but then there are also like bad ideas such as the sculpture on the cultural center in the town of Mechelen, which has been traveling around the whole Belgium and representing one refugee in a boat. So in a way, it's a very interesting place. I mean, the more the more I'm finding out, the more I'm getting enthusiastic about it. Doreen, you also mentioned my inspiration of Isabelle Stengers' notion of the slow research, and it's something that I will try and that I also do in a way that I did or that I tried to do with several projects before. It's a investment, investigation and investment of time into the exhibition project, so that the exhibition is not something that opens and is then to stay in the form of objects that you can come and visit and see and experience. But I wish to understand in that way the Biennial as a place where we could instigate, where we can induce practices, where we can induce projects with the artists, with theoreticians, with activists that would be running roughly along year and a half, and most probably I would restitute them at the end of the duration for one day. In whatever form, I don't know yet, but I would like to go in a way furthermore into the question of whom do these biennials talk to, and to think about, to be actually quite ungenerous towards the usual art audience, and more think about actually the way the practices can inscribe themselves into a social fabric in an interesting way, but again having as a kind of very important, let's say, a very important model, not to go into imposing things, but working with, not working for or not working about, but working with. So this is where also the time and this against acceleration, so the slowness which comes against the topic of acceleration and the notions of acceleratedness of the capitalism, accelerated of all the mobilities that we have been producing, is something that very interestingly Isabelle Stengers talks about in something that she calls a plea for slow research, which was marked by her colleague being fired. Barbara van Dijk is her name. She was fired from Leuven University in 2011 after having publicly explained and endorsed the action against a genetically modified potato field in Belgium, I believe. And according to Stengers, Barbara was fired because of the position she took as a citizen and not as a researcher. And this prompted her to take a firm stand against the idea of neutral, disinterested production of knowledge, especially in the field of hard science, to which, of course, Stenger, as you know, as a chemist, comes from. She also wants that this slow research exists against the development and industrial innovation, which is always oriented towards application and immediate financialization of that research. She says, for example, she talks about the feeling of shame that drives her when she sees these young generations of students to whom she's talking. And she says, for example, we know that those who enter university today belong to the generation that will have to face in future the challenges of which we just cannot imagine. Our ways of life will have to change, and this certainly entails a change in the way we relate to our environment, social and ecological, but also in the ways of our academic knowledge relates to its environment. And so in arguing how this scientific reliability that is so important in a way when the new scientific methodologies are produced, and this she argues that this scientific reliability should have not only a scientific judgment but also a social and political one. And in that sense, she says it's something that would be similar to the slow knowledge of a gardener rather than a fast knowledge of the so-called rational industrial agriculture. And in that sense, of course, it goes along with her call to learning to listen, as she brings it back again in the last book, and paying attention. So again, two qualities that need time. right? They need time and need a relation. Or, as very beautifully Fred Moten also says, so we have to slow down to remain, so we can get together and think about how to get together. What if it turns out that the way we get together is the way to get together? Let's share so we can differ in under common misunderstanding. And I think that's really, really beautifully put, as always with Fred Moten. So in that sense, I prepared a few inspirations that are very important for me, or on which I worked recently. And I decided just to name them with relations, alliances, intersections, interdependencies. And I think with the first film that you can see, which is the film done in '85, that was commissioned by Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir, where I belong to a research group called Traveling Feminists. This was a film by one documentary filmmaker, Françoise Dasque, and I'm showing it currently in this exhibition in Ghent. And it was for me a huge revelation about the forms of engagement that we need today, and what kind of forms of gathering and assemblies, as recently also Judith Butler calls again this notion of assembly. It's something that I'm being non-modest here, but I would wish to reenact this as a part of the Biennial as well. So I'm going to not you, not yet. Thank you very much, but you. Thank you. So this is the beginning, which explains a little bit. It's without a voiceover. It's only juxtaposition of different perspectives, sometimes opposing perspectives, of the forum. I should say what the forum was about, but it also introduces in the film, as you will see. This was the third, this forum for women took place at the same time as the United Nations organized the third forum for women in '85, after 75 and 80. And during this one in Nairobi in '85, there was a huge forum taking place outside of the building where the UN nations were gathering and discussing about the position of women. But this was only the activists, NGOs from really all over the world. And what Françoise Dasque did was she captured some of those positions and voices. And this is the beginning of the film.
Yeah, I teach at a school and I teach privately. I teach college kids and I teach grown-ups and children. talking about 11:30 to 2. Is that right? The time we had?
12:30
to 2.
For an hour and a
12:30 to 2.
half. Thursday, the 17th, the 18th.
They must have been exhausted, I mean, after the...
Announcements, all kinds of stuff.
So this is the place where they were doing, every day they were producing journals. We are showing them also in the exhibition.
They had some newspapers from 2 days ago left over.
So they're covering different things. So I'll just go and show some of the more conflictual situations.
Book. They do not have that right. I would like to know your comment.
If the Israeli propaganda had been to show us on camels, yeah, there are nomads amongst us, but we're not all nomads. I come from that generation, and I'm not the only one. I'm not unique. There are many, many, many others who are much better than I am. And it's not nice to say things like that. I refuse that. I'm not a nomad. Even if I was a nomad, even if I was a nomad, even if I had a tail, I have right to the land. Israeli women who are trying to get to a peace are very weak, are very few. We need all the support we can get. I know that Palestinian women have a very difficult fight. We can't try and help from inside Israeli society to do something. But for that, just taking time and time again, the points we have won't lead us anywhere. The only way is really try and get how can we do something? Or maybe only we as Israelis, how can we Israeli women do something to help the Palestinian struggle? How can we do something together?
Okay. The time that we allotted.
So, and then there was the visit of Angela Davis. With a very short...
Excuse me, I have a cold like everybody else, I think, at this conference.
Oh, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, she had asked first. The question is, how do I define feminism? Okay. I'll turn around. That's, of course, a question that could absorb hours and hours of discussion, as we know. As a matter of fact, many women are debating over that very question here at the forum. I would argue that in order truly to be an activist in the fight for women's equality, we have to recognize that women are oppressed as women, but we are also oppressed because of our racial and national background. We're also oppressed because of our class background. And there are those who might say that let's forget about race and class. We're all sisters. Let us join hands across races, across classes. Well, I think we should join hands across races, across classes. But the specificity of our specific oppression must be recognized and acknowledged. And our struggles are not the same struggles in the sense that when Amari Reagan comes to Nairobi to represent the United States of America, she does not represent me.
So there, as you see, there is a moment where it's very interesting because, as you see, the whole film is constructed around this voices and positions, and what I really appreciate with this filmmaker is that she just by building these dialogues, we really feel actually the spaces of contestation that were happening, and that were able to be there because there was a space, there was a time And even if the goals were not the same, as we can see, for example, they are coming from Iran, they are the sort of official, they are having an official discourse about where the place of the women is, as they say, it's inside of the house. They even claim the woman is independent from economically, the husband has to do everything for her, and she has this liberty. And then just after that, she puts, for example,
doesn't have any duty to work in the home. She has got no duty to cook, to clean, to wash, to scrub, nothing. And whatever she does in the eyes of Islam at home, besides child rearing, is a favor that she gives to her husband. Women have lost the right of divorce. Women have lost the right of custody of their children, the right of guardianship over their children. Men can marry as many wives as they would like, and men can object to the occupation of their wives. And in the penal law, women, as you know, our penal law is a barbaric, really law. Murder is treated as a private matter which should be settled.
Well, so I could go on and on. It's a really fascinating document. If you are interested to see it, I can always send you a link. I'll be very happy to do that. And this intersection, or this intersectional methodology, is something that was very much thought around that same moment throughout the 80s, and especially throughout the feminists of the global South. And I think it at least for me, but not only for me, but I think for a lot of academicians and cultural producers that belong to this decolonizing questioning, the necessity of intersectionality, as for example was also very present in the way Angela Davis spoke. It's something that is again incontournable. It's something that is not possible to not be there, and as a kind of almost like an acquis. Another important topic for me is, but it very much relates to what I was saying now, is of course the relations about which we heard today already with the students. So I just wanted to give 2 minutes of the beginning of the beautiful film done by Mantia Diawara on Edouard Glissant. Because he introduces exactly this notion of racial capitalism, which is a notion that comes very much from the American academia, US-based academia, and that I hope will gather its importance more and more in the academia in other places as well, because it's much needed. What Edouard says in the beginning, it relates to. It's one word in relation is the film.
C'est l'histoire Colomb qui était parti lorsqu'on a créé le Nouveau Monde, et c'est moi qui suis revenu. Et d'être sur ce bateau, ce n'est pas une revanche stupide, ce serait la chose la plus énorme qu'on puisse dire, mais c'est amusant de savoir que mes ancêtres sont allés dans le Nouveau Monde dans de terribles conditions qui n'étaient pas celles-ci. Toute diaspora, c'est un passage de l'unité à la multiplicité. C'est ce qui est important dans tous les mouvements du monde. N'oublions pas que l'Afrique a été la source de toutes les sortes de diaspora. Il y a eu la diaspora il y a des millions d'années qui a donné naissance aux humanitaires. que l'Afrique c'est le berceau des humanités. Et il y a eu d'autres diasporas, par exemple la diaspora forcée de l'esclavage. Et aujourd'hui, il y a des diasporas aussi forcées à cause de la pauvreté et de la misère, des émigrés et des émigrations. Par conséquent, il y a dans la condition de l'Afrique, on dirait, une sorte de vocation à l'ailleurs, à aller ailleurs.
And so, sorry, going back. So in that sense, I would like to link it, and this will be in a way closing, kind of like closing parenthesis about the necessity of degrowth and rethinking of how, again, like it's a pretentious. I totally have a feeling it's a pretentious word to say decolonizing of Biennial, but why I insist on this degrowth so much is also especially by, just having this juxtaposition of two maps, which are the Internet Submarine Cable map, which is a contemporary map, of course, and the slave trade, and of course they are overlaid. It's very much like. It very much reflects the roadmap of the world trade, which was several centuries ago. This Atlantic Ocean was, of course, uniting the transatlantic slave trade, on which the accumulation of wealth, as we all know, has been constructed, and hence the late capitalism in which we live is very much a product of that specific point in time. And why is it interesting to have that in mind? Of course, is because this represents a society which is obsessed with instant communication, and we have talked today about the aluminium present in all kinds of gadgets in our computers, mobile phones. It's also coltan, as Saul Williams, the famous slam poet, says, coltan is as cotton. Coltan as cotton. He repeats it 4 times in his poem, coltan as cotton. We know where these elements are coming from, the way they are produced, the what kind of enslaved conditions this extraction again produces this phenomenon that actually enables us to be global, mobile, connected, doing idiotic selfies like proposed by Ai Weiwei, who invited celebrities to pose in rescue foils meant for refugees, or where this vision of Mark Zuckerberg is, for example, leading us. Well, I think this is one of the very important outcomes and results of where this kind of growth and demand and unreflexive behavior actually leads to is actually the situations like this, for example, in China, India, and Ghana, which are first 3 countries which accumulate electronic waste and have it processed in the slums, where people burn, of course, these materials in order to produce more, to get to the material which is then potentially recyclable. But what this does to their health is, of course, and not to mention, of course, for example, coltan and Congo, the mines in Congo, where there has been a lot of research done from the side of journalists this time, since the recent years, which show the level of the child labor involved in the extractivism of Congo, of coltan. So on this rather very cruel image, I would like to open for the discussion. I hope that it was a bit clear about my positions. I didn't show you a lot of what I did before. I have like 20 more slides of the project that I did recently in Beirut last year. That was about climate change and ecological, social ecology and political ecology in Lebanon and around Lebanon, and which very much inspired me to present also then this project to Mechelen, and in which precisely we were doing things like toxic tours, ecofeminist workshops. We also tried to trace the materials that are used for production of the artworks. So, for example, we tried to go in, you know how you put, like, for example, cartel, you put a caption for, like, is it a projection or whatever, but we tried to scale it down into including all the materials that we could trace from where they came, like ink, if we knew, or the paper where it came from, or the cardboard where it came from, etc. So I also think it's, and we tried to calculate the carbon emission of the production of the exhibition as well. But yeah, so that's my exercises in Degrowth. And yeah, if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.